Usually when two programs exchange information over the internet, that data is in some known format. For example, when a web browser connects to a web server and downloads information, that data is usually in some version of hypertext markup language or HTML. That, in conjunction with some JavaScript or some cascading style sheets, also referred to as CSS, gives the browser enough information for it to display the website that the web server has provided. Other applications may need to exchange data as well, and instead of having their own format, information is oftentimes exchanged in a general format called JSON, which stands for JavaScript Object Notation. It is a language-independent text format that allows machines and programs to exchange information that is easily readable, even by humans. The data is represented as records and arrays. The most basic primitive in JSON is the JSON object, which is denoted by an opening and closing curly brace. Inside, you will find the members, which is a comma-separated list of string value pairs. A JSON array is denoted by an opening and closing square bracket, which is then composed of a comma-separated list of values. A value in JSON can be a string, a number, an object, that is a JSON object, an array, which is a JSON array, the Boolean values true or false, or null, which tends to represent the absence of a value. A string is any collection of Unicode characters, and a number is a general purpose representation of any number type. Instead of having, say, integers and floats, JSON simply has number, which represents any of those types. To use JSON in Android, we tend to use two classes, JSON object, which represents a JSON object, and JSON array, which represents a JSON array. Inside a JSON object, we find a collection of name-value pairs where the name is always a unique string and the value can be a JSON object or JSON array, a string, a Boolean value, or any of the number types, integer, long, or double. You can also have null as a value. As mentioned earlier, JSON gives us a way to exchange information between two entities or two applications on the internet where there isn't a prescribed protocol for the exchange of that information between those applications. Let's take a look at an example. Here we see the XKCD website. This is a webcomic that publishes a new comic every day. Now, in addition to being funny, what's interesting about the XKCD website is that in addition to being able to view each comic on the website, they actually provide a web API that allows an application to pull in information about a comic and then use that information internally. In order to view the latest comic, you can use this URL, or to view a specific comic, you can use this URL. When you fetch either of those URLs, what will be returned is a JSON object that contains information about the comic that you've requested. If we take a look at the raw data, we can see that this is just one long string. We can tell because of the beginning and closing curly braces that this is a JSON object. By formatting it, it's easier for us to read, where we can see that the elements inside are the month of the comic, the specific number, a year, a safe title, transcript, which is a description of the joke or some additional joke related to the comic, alt text, which is usually some type of description, a URL to the specific comic image, a title, and the day of the month on which this comic was published. What we would like to do is we'd like to create an application that is able to display an XKCD comic by simply specifying the comic number, fetching the information from the URL, and then loading the relevant information inside the application. What we have so far is a simple user interface where we have specified two text views that will be used to display the comic title and some comic description, an image view that will be used to display the comic image, an edit text that will allow us to enter the comic number that we would like to view, and a button that we will use to fetch the comic once we have entered the comic number. So let's go through each of the steps that we'll need to perform. Here we have wired up all of our views. So what we'd like is for this application to essentially do everything when the user hits the show button. So we're going to give an on-click listener to our show button. When the user clicks the show button, what would we like to happen? Well, our goal is to load all the relevant comic information into our application. So the first thing I need to know is what's the URL that will be used to fetch information. Reminding ourselves of the URL format, we see that it is the domain, followed by the comic number, followed by this fixed suffix. So by bringing this URL format into our application, we can create our own URL by simply taking this prefix, injecting our own comic number, and leaving this suffix. Now the comic number will be entered by the user into this edit text. That edit text is specified here. So all we will need to say is number edit text dot text will be injected, and that is how we will create our URL string. Now we need to take this URL and fetch the comic information from the server. To do this, I'm going to use Volley. So I'm going to need a Volley request queue. And to this queue, I'm going to add a new request. The request type I'm going to add is going to be a new type called a JSON object request. Essentially, if the information that you're fetching from a web server is in a JSON object format, then Volley's JSON object request will download the information and automatically convert it to a JSON object in your application. So a JSON object request needs 3 arguments. The first is the URL, where we're going to make the request. The second is a lambda that will be called if the request is successful. And the third argument is another lambda that will be called if there is failure. In our success callback, we see that it receives an argument of type JSON object. We reference it with it. This JSON object will represent the element that is fetched from the web server. So what does that object look like? Let's remind ourselves. It's a JSON object that has these items. So in our application, the first thing we may want to do is to set up our title text view. The title text view will have its text value be the title from the JSON object. The title from the JSON object has title as its name and then a string as the value. So in our code, we will, from the JSON object, get string, since that is the type of the value, and the name is title. We can test our application just to see if we are at least getting that information. So we're going to type in a comic number. We don't have any checks here to prevent errors, so we're just going to type in valid information. So we need to type in a comic number that exists. XKCD has been online for many years, and they now have thousands of published comics. So if we stick to the low 100s, we should be fine. So I'll type for a comic number 123, hit show comic, and see what we get. And I see that the title is now showing centrifugal force. So whatever we have downloaded, that's the title information that was stored there. So having gotten the title working, let's do the same thing for the description text view. We want its text value to be something from the JSON object. In this case, we don't really have anything that explicitly says title, but we do have this, or we don't have anything that says description, but we do have this alternative text that sort of gives an explanation of what you're looking at. Sometimes this is kind of like an extra joke. So what we could do is put the alt text as the description. So we will simply call getString again, but this time we'll pass in alt as the name. Running this application, if we now type 123, we see centrifugal force. You spin me right round, baby, right round, in a manner depriving me of an inertial reference frame, which is funny. Okay, so the last piece of information that needs to be filled in is the comic itself. Now, reminding ourselves that inside the JSON object, what we have is a URL to the comic with the name img for image. This means that my application will need to download this comic in order to display it. This is something I could do manually with some low-level code, but it turns out that probably the best way to do this is using a library. A very popular library that is used to do image management in Android development is called Picasso. In order to utilize Picasso, just like any other library, we want to add the library reference to our application's dependencies. So we can simply take the implementation line, place it in our build.gradle, hit sync, and everything gets downloaded. Now, using Picasso is relatively straightforward. Essentially, to use it, we specify an image and a target. So Picasso will allow me to load a specific image, and we can specify that image in many ways. One of them is to simply give a URI, which stands for Uniform Resource Identifier, a URL, which is Uniform Resource Locator, is a URI. So we can pass the image value from our JSON object to the load function. This will load the image. Now we need to tell it where to display it. We'll tell it to load it into this image view. And that's it. We can now run our application again. And in addition to seeing the title and the alternative text for comic 1, 2, 3, we can also now see the comic itself. Give this a second. And there we see Picasso handled the download in the background and is now able to show us the comic. So this is one of the ways that we can process information that we download from the web. Lots of times, the information that we download from a web server will be in a JSON object or JSON array format, and we can download and process that information either ourselves by using low-level network operations or by using libraries such as Volley that can do a lot of the heavy lifting for us. Additionally, managing images, especially when it comes to downloading and displaying those images, can be done using libraries as well. This is essentially the basics for building network-enabled applications that are able to connect to web services and process the data that it finds there.